Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Developing a Proper Worldview. This is going to be episode 31, and again, I just want to start by saying if you're catching this just randomly, please try to go back and watch these in numerical order. There is a lot of importance on how these are laid out. I'm taking you through the same journey I went through in my faith walk, discovering how this world works, why it's moving in the direction it is, why a new world order, one world government is a bad idea, but it will come to pass because the Bible states so. So you must have a biblical foundation to understand these things. So I'm not going to repeat that message. I kind of go over that each and every time, but just know that it's important that you have a relationship with Jesus Christ and that you're looking at these events through a biblical lens with a biblical foundation. So we just finished up the 7-part creation seminar series by Dr. Kent Hovind, going through and providing evidence that shows that the theory of evolution is based on pseudoscience, that there's no facts to back it up. Speaking, of course, about macroevolution. Microevolution, which is a terrible name, which is just variation within a species, has no credence on creation. It has nothing to do with our start as a life form, and it fits the biblical narrative, and all science fits the biblical narrative. Whereas the theory of evolution, macroevolution, is nonsensical. It's fantasy. It's pure speculation based on a rejection of the biblical narrative, because people don't want God. They have to come up with some sort of fantasy. And evolution, as illogical, dumb, and unscientific as it is the only thing they have. So they cling to it with religious fervor. And because this is the devil's world, he's in control. And lost people are what the Bible calls children of wrath, controlled by the spirit of disobedience, controlled by satanic powers, guided and directed in an evil antichrist direction. Because of that, this world promotes the theory of evolution from an academic education, political, even Hollywood media perspective. They all push this same narrative, this antichrist, anti-God narrative, this humanistic philosophy that undergirds all of society and is really just the driving force towards a new world order. It's this underlying current behind the scheme for a new world order. And so Dr. Kent Hovind did a great job of showing that, showing how foolish evolution is, how accurate the Bible is, how all science, when looked at objectively, fits the biblical narrative. And so, I mean, if you watch those, like I say, with an open mind, there's no way you walk away from it believing in evolution. There's no way, unless you want to. And then you'll suppress the truth and unrighteousness, like the Bible says. But to kind of supplement the Dr. Kent Hovind Creation Seminar series, we're going to look at several other documentaries, several other DVDs that touch on the same subject from a different aspect. And the first one we're going to look at here tonight is called Unlocking the Mysteries of Life. And I can't exactly remember what this one is about. I believe it shows, the thing that sticks out in my mind the most is how it shows molecular biology, like biology on the minuscule microscopic scale, like bacteria, DNA, and how amazingly, unbelievably, jaw-droppingly detailed these things are, and are complete and total evidence of intelligent design. There's absolutely no possible way that these things evolved piecemeal. And so this video is going to show that in overwhelming evidence, by like scientists showing the actual science. And it's just a really amazing, eye-opening DVD. Like I say, it's been a long time since I've watched it, so I don't remember a whole lot about it other than that, I think. I might be mixing it up with Icons of Evolution, because I watched, and that's the next one we're going to watch too. They go hand in hand, kind of. I can't remember which touches on which. But we're going to start that. I don't know how long it is, maybe an hour and a half, so it's probably going to take 2 episodes to get through it. But without further introduction, let's just jump into it, and we'll see what it has to offer. All right, so here we go. This is exciting. We were on that Dr. Kent Hovind series for quite a long time, so it's exciting here to touch on something new. Not it's the same subject, but a new direction. So this should be fun to watch. Let's just jump into it. Must have been made in the 90s. Remember how the VHS would always jump back in the day?
In 1993, Professor Philip Johnson of the University of California at Berkeley invited a group of scientists and philosophers to a small beach town on the central coast of California. They came from major academic centers, including Cambridge, Munich, and the University of Chicago, to question an idea that had dominated science for 150 years.
I think Pajaro Dunes represented a turning point for many of us. Individually, we all had questions about evolutionary theory, but when we came together, each person brought something of their own to the table, and suddenly we all had a glimpse of a new way of looking at life that none of us had individually seen before.
I would have to say that this was an intense period of time in my life. It just seemed that there was something here much more intellectually satisfying than the view that I had held up until this time.
So right out the gate, this sounds like it's like the atheists and proponents of evolution can't just automatically discredit this and say, oh, it's just religious fanatics. This doesn't sound like religious fanatics at all. These are major university scientists and professors getting together for what seems like not religious purposes, but simply because they're open-minded skeptics, which is what science is supposed to be. You're supposed to question everything. And so they have questions about, in their individual fields about the theory of evolution. They're looking at things going, this theory doesn't exactly answer my questions. We're missing something here. And so they get together to discuss it. Again, not from a religious aspect, but from a pure, true scientific aspect. From a let's experiment, let's test, let's observe, let's question things. Today's the evolutionary science. It's not allowed to be questioned. Scientific journals won't even give the time of day to somebody from a creationist standpoint. That's not science. That's propaganda.
Looking back on it now, I think that gave me the motivation to actually look at the evidence and just see where I thought it pointed.
That's what science is supposed to do.
I realized that this was bigger than any one person or discipline, and this was the beginning of a community of scientists who were now willing to face the fundamental mystery of life's origin.
Cheesy intro, very 90s feeling.
I sometimes wonder why anybody talks about anything else, because this is the most interesting topic there is. Where did we come from? How did we get here? What brought us into existence? What is our relationship to reality as a whole?
You look at the incredible diversity and complexity of life, and inevitably the question arises, what brought all this into existence? Was it simply chance and necessity, undirected natural forces? Or is there something else going on? Is there a purpose, a plan, a design due to an intelligent cause? I think that is the fundamental question.
The scientist who came to...
Dude, when you just look at things objectively, you have two options. Nothing created this. It's all just random chance. And even that, it immediately is illogical, because you go, well, hold on now. Where did, even if it is random chance, molecules just coming together, where did the molecules come from? Where did the energy come from? Where did the laws of nature come from? Things have to have a starting point. There has to be a creative force. Versus intelligent designer, when you look at the articulate mastery, is that what's my word I'm looking for? Masters. I can't pronounce that word, but perfection of all of life. When you look at everything from symbiotic life forms to the perfection of the environment on Earth to sustain life, the laws of nature, the ebb and flow of the tides, the design on a butterfly, like they were showing, everything has such creativity, such purpose, such functionality, that it screams intelligent designer. The only reason to go that other direction is because you don't want there to be an intelligent, because the moment you admit there's an intelligent designer, then you're left going, okay, who is this intelligent designer and what does he require of us? It puts yourself in subjection to somebody else, and nobody wants that. People don't want that, so they go to this random chance stuff where I am the author of my own fate. I'm my own God. I can do whatever I want. I'm not in subjection to anybody. So that's the allurement of the insanity and illogicalness of the other position. But if you just look at it objectively, you go, of course there's an intelligent designer. Look at the evidence.
Our duels set out to re-examine the mystery of life's origin, for each had significant doubts about widely held evolutionary ideas. Among them, biochemist Michael B. questioned how natural processes could have assembled the intricate structures found within living cells. Dean Kenyon was an evolutionary biologist who no longer thought that chemistry alone could account for the origin of life on Earth. And Stephen Meyer, Paul Nelson, and William Dembski were seeking a new approach, one that could explain the origin of the genetic information encoded in living organisms. These scientists and philosophers began to formulate an alternative to the central theory of modern biology, a theory born in the mind of a British naturalist. His name was Charles Darwin. In 1831, Darwin, then 22 years old, set sail on a 5-year survey expedition for the British Empire. He journeyed from England on the HMS Beagle, traveling around the southern tip of South America, then north toward a chain of volcanic islands in the Pacific called the Galapagos.
And remember, Darwin was not a scientist. He had no degree in sciences. He had a degree in theology. And he had lost his faith in the Bible. So he had,
on this desolate archipelago, 600 miles off the western coast of Ecuador, Charles Darwin encountered an extraordinary array of birds, reptiles, and mammals, the likes of which he had never seen before. For more than a month, Darwin studied plant and animal life, took extensive notes, and collected specimens. Then he left, never to return. 25 years passed as he developed a theory about how the diverse forms of life on Earth had originated. In 1859, Darwin published a book titled On the Origin of Species. Its impact on science and ultimately all of Western culture was dramatic. Darwin argued that all life was the product of purely undirected natural forces, time, chance, and a process he called natural selection.
For 2,500 years before Darwin, most prominent scientists and philosophers, people such as Plato or Newton or Kepler, viewed the world as the product of some kind of design or plan. But a fundamental shift occurs with Darwin's idea of natural selection, and a real change in scientific philosophy is set in motion.
Darwin was not the first scientist to propose a theory of evolution, but he was the first to offer a plausible naturalistic mechanism that could produce biological change over long periods of time. To understand how natural selection works, consider the finch populations Darwin encountered on the Galapagos Islands.
13 species of finches inhabit the Galapagos Islands, and they vary subtly in terms of their body size and shape of the beak. Darwin returned to England with 9 different species of these birds.
According to contemporary Darwinian theory, differences in the sizes and shapes of the birds' beaks are the direct result of natural selection. One example often cited involves species of seed-eating finches. Following seasons of heavy rain, small, soft seeds are plentiful throughout the islands. Birds with short beaks can easily gather food. However, during periods of drought, the only seeds available are encased in hard, tough shells that remain on the ground from the previous year. In these circumstances, only birds with longer, sharper beaks can crack the shells and eat the seeds.
Those birds with the longer beaks survive because they can reach the food source, whereas other birds cannot. That long beak, then, confers what biologists now call a functional advantage. The finches with smaller beaks, unfortunately, die out from starvation because they cannot reach that food source. If the drought conditions continue, the environment causes a change in the features of the finch population as a whole. Over time, the long beaks are passed on to succeeding generations because those beaks enable the birds to survive.
Natural selection was a powerful idea. Physical variations that proved advantageous would be inherited by succeeding generations. Through this process, populations would be altered, and over time, fundamentally different organisms would arise without any form of intelligent guidance.
And that's where the mysticism comes in. The observational fact is, okay, we got long beaks and short beaks, and like Hovind talked about, like, that's microevolution, which is just variation within a species. There's no new information being added to the DNA structure. The genes for long beaks and short beaks exist in that bird. It's already present in the DNA. And through breeding and environment, the ones with the long beak survive or breed, and so that stronger gene is passed on. But no new information has been added. It's simply natural selection is just that, a selection. The DNA is selecting within a code that already exists. There's no new information, no new DNA. In order for that bird to become something else, new DNA would have to be introduced. And that has never, ever, ever occurred, never been observed. It's myth, it's fantasy. There is natural selection within the existing DNA code, which is simply variation within a species. Like Hovind talked about, you can get a big dog, a little dog, but you always get a dog. You can get a short-haired dog, long-haired dog, brown dog, white dog, whatever, long-eared dog, short-eared dog. That's all traits that exist already within the DNA code. So there's no new nothing new is being created. That's where the myth comes in. Then they say, oh, perhaps over long periods of time, these small variations could actually no. You're missing the point. Nothing new has been added to the DNA. It's a selection within pre-existing code. It's like your computer program, choosing to run one program without another. It's never going to have just a new functionality that isn't written into its code, unless an intelligent designer adds the code. The code that exists in your computer exists, and depending on what program is running, it's selecting the code to run, but it's selecting from a pre-existing thing. That pre-existing thing is never going to produce something that is not already present. It can't. It's written code. The program is just selecting the code. And so nothing new is going to be added unless an intelligent external designer adds new code. It requires intelligent design. It can't produce new code on its own simply because the program chooses this code. All of a sudden, ooh, we got a new code. No, it's choosing from pre-existing code.
Darwin wanted to explain everything in the history of life in terms of undesigned, unintelligent natural processes. And when he looked for an explanation, what he found was that a process he could observe in domestic populations also operates in the wild. Now, Darwin himself was very familiar with domestic breeding. He himself studied pigeon breeding. And he knew that for centuries, human breeders had been able to make dramatic changes in populations by selecting only certain individuals to breed. Darwin really suggested that the same process operates in the wild.
For Charles Darwin, natural selection explained the appearance of design without a designer. There was no longer any need to invoke an intelligent cause for the complexity of life. In effect, natural selection became a kind of designer substitute.
Today, Darwinism is generally assumed throughout science and the academic world. Yet, despite its wide acceptance, a growing number of scientists and scholars, including those who met at Pajaro Dunes, now challenge key aspects of Darwinian theory.
When we came together at Pajaro Dunes, we certainly didn't agree on everything, but we did share a real dissatisfaction with the mechanism of natural selection and the role that it was playing in biological explanation. Natural selection is a real process, and it works well for explaining certain limited kinds of variation, small-scale change. We have lots of examples of that, in fact. Where it doesn't work well is explaining what Darwin thought it could, namely the real complexity of life. We have a finch beak, and then you've got the finch itself. A minor change in the structure of the beak versus the origin of the organism itself. These are different scales of phenomena. These are different kinds of problems. And the important problem for biology is to understand where natural selection works and where it doesn't, and why there's a difference. Evidence is very powerful, and all of us have the sense that if we let that evidence speak for itself, that it would lead us in a very different direction, away from natural selection and towards a different conclusion about the origin and nature of life on Earth.
Natural selection acts only by taking advantage of slight successive variations. She can never take a great suddenly, but must advance by short and sure, though slow steps.
It's really interesting to notice that the more we know about life and the more we know about biology, the more problems Darwinism has and the more design becomes apparent.
Amen.
Since 1988, Dr. Michael B. has investigated complex biological systems that seem to defy explanation by natural selection.
For the longest time, I believed that Darwinian evolution explains what we saw in biology, not because I saw how it could actually explain it, but because I was told that it did explain it. And in schools, I was taught Darwinian biology. And through college and graduate school, I was in an atmosphere which just assumed that Darwinian evolution explained biology. And again, I didn't have any reason to doubt it. It wasn't until about 10 years or more ago that I read a book called Evolution, the Theory in Crisis by a geneticist by the name of Michael Denton, an Australian. And he put forward a lot of scientific arguments against Darwinian theory that I had never heard before. And the arguments seemed pretty convincing. And at that point, I started to get a bit angry because I thought I was being led down a primrose path. Here were a number of very good arguments, and I had gone through a doctoral program in biochemistry, became a faculty member, and I had never even heard of these things. And so from that point on, I became very interested in the question of evolution. and since have decided that Darwinian processes are not the whole explanation for life.
Michael Behe's skepticism derived in large measure from what modern biology has revealed about life's most fundamental unit, the cell.
In the 19th century, when
This is just amazing to me, and this is how God works. It's so cool. So to disprove the wisdom of men is just utter foolishness to God. Like, God can take the most simplistic, seemingly foolish thing and confound all the wisdom of men. So what does the Lord do? He takes the smallest thing, the cell, and he's going to use it to just destroy evolution. It's just amazing. It's awe-inspiring. It's God's genius is so just overwhelming.
Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple glob of protoplasm, like a little piece of jello or something, that was not hard to explain at all.
This perception didn't really change too much until the early 1950s. But in the last half-century, our knowledge of the cell has just exploded.
Man,
Today, powerful technologies reveal elaborate microscopic worlds.
look what's going on
So
down there.
small that a thimbleful of cultured liquid can contain more than 4 billion single-cell bacteria, each packed with circuits, assembly instructions, and miniature machines, the complexity of which Charles Darwin could never have imagined.
It's mind-boggling.
At the very basis of life, where molecules and cells run the show, we've discovered machines, literally molecular machines.
Yep.
There are little molecular trucks that carry supplies from one end of the cell to the other. There are machines which capture the energy from sunlight and turn it into usable energy.
There are as many molecular machines in the human body as there are functions that the body has to do. So if you think about hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling, blood clotting, respiratory action, the immune response, all of those require a host of machines.
When we look at these machines, we ask ourselves, where do they come from? And the standard answer, Darwinian evolution, is very inadequate in my view.
In speaking on the topic of scientific naturalism,
During the early 1990s, at a series of academic conferences, Behe first shared his doubts about the ability of natural selection to construct complex molecular machines. One machine particularly attracted his attention.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum. With all of its parts and all of its glory, it had a propeller and a hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed. That's no chance assemblage of parts.
Amen.
Behe's reaction was not surprising, for the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron...
Look at this. This is just on the back of dude, just one tiny section of a bacteria. You have to microscope in 50,000 times just to get a look at it. And the design and the complexity. And who knows, like, even beyond that, like, how deep does the wisdom of God go? Like, we don't even, like, what about what we can't see? What's even further, you know, what happens at 3 million microscopic lens? You know, what's going on inside that thing? Like, and then you look to the external on the grand scale, the universes and the stars, and man, this God we serve is immense. He is a huge, mighty, wise God beyond all comprehension. It's terrifying. The old preachers used to use the word terrible, or the terrible God, and we've corrupted that word to mean something it doesn't. But it means full of terror, Like, it's awe-inspiring. Like, when you stand at the precipice of the Grand Canyon and look over the edge, you get terrified about, the immensity of it, the danger of it. This is the God we serve, this immense, powerful God who creates on the subatomic level a complexity that boggles the human mind, that we can't even fathom. And that's on that subatomic level, and yet he's created on the grand universal level. It's staggering.
On micrographs like this one to identify the parts and three-dimensional structure of the flagellar motor.
This thing's amazing. Pay attention to this.
In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
And even though they're spinning that fast, they can stop on a dime. It only takes a quarter turn for them to stop and shift directions and start spinning 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
And just like outboard motors on motorboats, it has a large number of parts which are necessary for the motor to work.
So this is important too. Darwinian evolution says that things evolve piecemeal. So like that base piece would have had to have evolved first. Then the connecting rod would have had to assemble to it. Then the shaft there, and then the spinning part, and like it all would have had to come together piecemeal after long periods of time. The problem with that is it doesn't function unless it comes all together pre-assembled. There's no purpose, and the evolution says that natural selection won't happen unless there's a purpose. The finch's beaks were longer and sharper because they had to get this seed. There was a purpose for the longer beaks. So these things wouldn't evolve unless there was a purpose. But that base wouldn't evolve unless it had everything else to go with it, because it would have no purpose, it would have no function. There's no need for it. The entire thing must come together as one, and everything is like that. The human eye has so many different pieces and complexities. The rods, the retinas, the pupil, the iris, all of it must come together in order to function. There would be no purpose for the rod to evolve by itself and then just sit there and wait for the rest to evolve. There's no purpose for it to evolve. It couldn't happen. The only way it happens is if it comes fully intact together. That's the only way it functions. And everything is like that. The bombardier beetle, you read about that in Scott Hughes' book, The Collapse of Evolution, how it has this crazy mechanism inside of it with chemicals that are combustible. If mixed, the beetle would explode. But there's no reason for it to have these chemicals without mixing, because the mixing is what causes the explosion, but it can't mix because the beetle would explode. So it has a timing mechanism and a release mechanism and an anti-inhibitor and an inhibitor while it's in it, and an anti-inhibitor when it comes out to cause the explosion. Like, it's so detailed, and the function only works as a whole. It wouldn't work evolving piecemeal. It just can't happen. So things like this blow evolution out of the water.
The bacterial flagellum, 2 gears forward and
I think Michael Behe calls it irreducible complexity, which the complexity of the machine can't be reduced beyond what it is in totality, which evolution would require.
It's water-cooled, proton motive force, it has a stator, it has a rotor, it has a U-joint, it has a drive shaft, it has a propeller, and they function as these parts of the machines. It's not convenient that we give them these names. That's truly their function.
Since its discovery, scientists have tried to understand how a rotary motor could have arisen through natural selection. As yet, they have failed to offer any detailed Darwinian explanation. To see why, we must understand a feature of molecular machines known as irreducible complexity.
Irreducible complexity was coined by Mike Behe in describing these molecular machines. Basically what it says is that you have multi-component parts to any given organelle or system in a cell, all of which are necessary for function. That is, if you remove one part, you lose function of that system.
The idea of irreducible complexity can be illustrated by a familiar, non-biological machine, a mousetrap. The trap is composed of 5 basic pieces: a catch to hold the bait, a strong spring, a thin bent rod called the hammer, a holding bar to secure the hammer in place, and a platform upon which the entire system is mounted. If any one of these parts is missing or defective, the mechanism will not work. All components of this irreducibly complex system must be present simultaneously for the machine to perform its function, catching mice. Irreducible complexity also applies to biological machines, including the bacterial flagellar motor.
All told, there are about 40 different protein parts which are necessary for this machine to work. And if any of those parts are missing, then either you get a flagellum that doesn't work because it's missing the hook or it's missing the drive shaft or whatever, or it doesn't even get built within the cell.
In evolutionary terms, you have to be able to explain how you can build this system gradually when there's no function until you have all those parts in place.
The irreducible complexity of molecular machines poses a severe challenge to the power of natural selection. According to Darwin's theory, even very complex biological structures like an eye, an ear, or a heart can be built gradually over time in small incremental steps. Yet, as Darwin made clear, natural selection can only succeed if these random genetic changes provide some advantage to the evolving organism in its struggle for survival.
As I have attempted to show, it is not necessary to suppose that the modifications are all simultaneous if they were extremely slight and gradual. Natural selection is scrutinizing the slightest variations, rejecting those that are bad, preserving and adding up all that are good.
But could Darwin's small, favorable variations have produced a bacterial flagellum? Some scientists doubt the possibility.
How could something new, like a bacterial flagellar motor and all the components that go with it, how could it develop out of a population of bacteria that don't have that system? When each change, according to Darwin's theory, has to provide some kind of advantage.
Imagine such a scenario early in the Earth's history. An evolving bacterium somehow develops a tail and perhaps even the pieces necessary to attach it to the cell wall. Yet without a complete motor assembly, this innovation would provide no advantage to the cell. Instead, the tail would lie immobile and useless, invisible to natural selection, which by definition can only favor changes that aid survival.
The logic of natural selection is very demanding. Unless the flagellum mechanism is completely assembled and actually works, natural selection simply cannot preserve it. It cannot be passed on to the next generation.
The important thing to realize about natural selection is it selects only for a functional advantage. In most cases, natural selection actually eliminates things that have no function or that have a function that harms the organism. So if you had a bacterium with a tail that didn't function as a flagellum, chances are natural selection would eliminate it. The only way you can select for a flagellum is if you have a flagellum that works, and that means you have to have all the pieces of the motor in place to begin with. So natural selection can't get you the bacterial flagellum. It can only work after the flagellum is there and operating.
In 1996, Michael Behe published a book titled Darwin's Black Box. In it, he argued that natural selection, Darwin's designer substitute, could not explain the origin of the bacterial flagellum or any other irreducibly complex biological system. Instead, Behe concluded that the integrated complexity of these systems pointed to intelligent design. Darwin's black box created immediate controversy. Over 75 publications, including some of the world's leading newspapers and scientific journals, reviewed the book. Some scientists praised Behe's work, while others dismissed it as unscientific and religiously motivated. Behe's critics also insisted that he had underestimated the power of natural selection. They argued that the flagellar motor could have been constructed from parts used to build simpler molecular machines, like this needle-nose cellular pump. If the components of the pump already existed, they could have been preserved by natural selection even before the bacterial motor arose. This theory is called co-option.
It's essentially saying that evolution or natural selection at some point was able to borrow components of one molecular machine and build a new machine with some of these components.
Scott Minnick has studied the flagellar motor for nearly 20 years. His research has led him to challenge the co-option argument.
With a bacterial flagellum, you're talking about a machine that's got 40 structural parts. Yes, we find 10 of them are involved in another molecular machine, but the other 30 are unique. So where are you going to borrow them from? Eventually, you're going to have to account for the function of every single part as originally having some other purpose. So you can only follow that argument so far until you run into the problem of you're borrowing parts from nothing. But even if you can see that you have all the parts necessary to build one of these machines, that's only part of the problem. Maybe even more complex, I think more complex, is the assembly instructions. That is never addressed by opponents of the irreducible complexity argument.
That's crazy. So, man, we're looking at the tail of a bacteria, as small as it gets, right? Now we're about to go smaller. We're going to look into the DNA, and then within the DNA, we're going to look at the protein molecules within the DNA structure. Like I'm saying, the wisdom of God just is like, the deeper you go, the more complex it gets.
Studies of the bacterial motor have indeed revealed an even deeper level of complexity. For its construction not only requires specific parts, but also a precise sequence of assembly.
You've got to make things at the right time. You've got to make the right number of components. You've got to assemble them in a sequential manner. You've got to be able to tell if you've assembled it properly so that you don't waste energy building a structure that's not going to be functional.
Building a molecular machine has been compared to the construction of a house, where workers follow a detailed blueprint and plan for assembly. The foundation of a house is poured before the walls are erected. Plumbing and electrical fixtures are installed prior to enclosing the walls of the structure. Windows must be hung before siding is applied, and shingles are attached only after plywood sheets are nailed to the rafters. So it is with the construction of a flagellar motor.
You build this structure from the inside out. You are counting the number of components in a ring structure or the stator, and once that's assembled, there's feedback that says, okay, no more of that component now. A rod is added, a ring is added, another rod is added, a U-joint is added. Once the U-joint's at a certain size and a certain degree of bend, about a quarter turn, that's shut off, and then you start adding components for the propeller.
And the Lord's using protein, building off instruction manuals, which is what DNA is, to do all this. It's stunning. Like, a connection that I've often made that just blows my mind too is God created through His Word. He spoke and everything was. DNA is language. All things are held together by Him, by His Word. DNA is language. It's an instruction code. It's there's no other way to describe it other than language. And that's how He spoke. And the power of His Word is in everything. And everything follows the commands. It follows the instruction manual. It's flabbergasting. It's like, That's so stunning.
These are all made in a precise sequence, just like you would build a building.
To build a motor correctly requires a complex system of machines that coordinate the timing of the assembly instructions. But how could natural selection construct such a system?
The co-option argument doesn't explain this. You see, in order to construct that flagellar mechanism, or tens of thousands of other such mechanisms in the cell, you require other machines to regulate the assembly of these structures. And those machines themselves require machines for their assembly.
If even one of these pieces is missing or put in the wrong place, your motor isn't going to work. So this apparatus to assemble the flagellar motor is itself irreducibly complex. In fact, what we have here is irreducible complexity all the way down.
We know a lot about the bacterial flagellum. We still have a lot to learn, but we know a lot about it. And there's no explanation for how this complex molecular machine was ever produced by a Darwinian mechanism.
150 years ago, scientists did not know about irreducibly complex molecular machines. Yet Charles Darwin anticipated the difficulty that systems such as these could pose to his theory.
If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down.
So Darwin just admitted you can throw my theory out the window.
There are really two big questions in biology. How do you get new living forms with new structures like wings and eyes from life that already exists? And secondly, how did life originate on Earth in the first place? Now, of course, we know that Darwin spent most of his life formulating an answer to the first of these two questions.
Charles Darwin compared the history of life on Earth to a great branching tree. The base of the tree represented the very first living cell, and the branches were new and more complex life forms that had evolved over time from the first primitive organism.
Darwin was trying to explain how the branches on a tree of life originated. He was trying to show how natural selection could have modified existing organisms to produce the great diversity of plant and animal life that fills the earth today. But when it came to the base of the tree, which represented the origin of the first life, the first living cell, Darwin had very little to say. In fact, in The Origin of Species, he didn't even address the question of how life might have originated from non-living matter.
The only glimpses we have of Darwin's opinions on the subject appear in a letter he wrote to a colleague named Joseph Hooker.
Regarding the first production of a living organism, if, and oh what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond, with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat and electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes, at the present such matter would be instantly devoured. But this may not have been the case before living creatures were formed.
During the final years of his life, Darwin did little to develop his idea that a primitive cell might have emerged from simple chemicals in the primordial waters of the early Earth. But later in the 1920s and 30s, a Russian scientist named Alexander Oparin formulated a detailed theory about how this could have happened. It was called chemical evolution.
Oparin thought that he could explain the origin of the first life using Darwinian principles. He envisioned simple chemicals combining and recombining to form larger molecules and then these larger molecules organizing themselves with the help of chance variations and natural selection into the first primitive living cell.
Over the next 3 decades, many scientists worked to develop and refine these ideas as they pondered the questions both Oparin and Darwin had raised. How could life have evolved from simple chemicals? One man thought he knew.
The problem of biological origins is, for a very long time, I would say, has been a real deep interest to me just because of the scale of the problem, the importance of it. Where did we come from? Why are we here? All that kind of question. Probed from the point of view of natural science.
During the late 1960s and throughout the 70s and early 80s, Dean Kenyon was one of the leading chemical evolutionary theorists in the world. And like others in his field, he was trying to explain how life on Earth began through a purely natural process.
In 1969, Kenyon co-authored an important book on the origin of life.
Gary Steinman and myself thought that if we were to pull together all of the lines of empirical evidence that had accumulated by the mid to late 60s in one continuous argument, we were very enthusiastic about the possibilities for explaining the origin of the main life-building elements.
Despite his optimism, Kenyon faced a significant problem. To explain how life began, he first had to account for the origin of the essential building blocks of every cell that has existed on Earth. Large, complex molecules called proteins.
Proteins have a wide range of function in the cell, everything from structural requirements in terms of scaffolding of the cell, the cytoskeleton, to enzymes, where they're actually processing molecules to harvest energy or to build components of the cell.
Proteins do pretty much all of the jobs inside of the cell, except for storing genetic information. That's left to the DNA, the RNA. But all the day-to-day jobs, cleaning up the cell, making energy, it's all proteins.
Kenyon knew that proteins would have been as important to the first life as they are to living cells today. He also recognized the complexity of their construction.
Let's stop there before they start getting into the protein section too deep. So we're at 34:58. We'll pick up there. All right, so there we go. We've started unlocking the mysteries of life. Very good information. If you're like me, you don't really have a scientific mind. Like I didn't go far in science in school. I couldn't even begin to tell you the elements on the periodic table. But I love that they take a very complex... I mean, these scientists, you know, they're doctors. They've been studying this. That guy they were just talking to, Kenyon, was doing his research in the 60s. So these guys have years and years and decades of accumulated knowledge. But I'm very glad, like, this documentary does a good job of taking these complex issues and explaining them in a way that can be grasped. And it helps that they use the word pictures and showing things. But when you just look at that bacteria tail, which was really the focus of the first half, and then I think the second half will get into the way protein functions, which again is just mind-blowing, and the way DNA and stuff like that works. It's like I say, the wisdom of God is overwhelmingly genius. I remember one time I was thinking about, like, may have been when I was studying this out, but I was thinking about this awe-inspiring wisdom of God, and I visualized, like, in my heart, like, standing next to this, like, huge, enormous wall, you know, just this monstrous, huge wall of information, you know, but in the vision it was just a wall, and just so big, so overwhelming, and it's just like, wow, that's the wisdom of God. And then in the vision, or in not a vision, but well, yeah, and this idea that I had in my heart, this vision that I was imagining, I scaled back to get a bigger view, and I was just looking at one cell of a monstrous complex brain. Like, what I can even begin to think about, and it overwhelms me, thinking about the complexity of the cells and the complexity of the monstrous universe. That's just one tiny sliver of the wisdom, the manifold, unending, unimaginable wisdom of God, that we're going to be spending all eternity worshiping and just learning from and just standing in awe of. God is so overwhelming, oh, so wise, so incomprehensible that you can't even begin to put it into words. It's too big to even comprehend. His wisdom is amazing, and we get just this tiny little fragment of a glimpse of it with things like this, and it blows us away. It's staggering, and that's just a tiny sliver, like one dot of an eye in all this page. That's the depth, the one tittle, or what do they call it? What did Jesus say? Not one jot or tittle. One jot and tittle blows our mind. And there's a whole book. And then the apostle said there's not enough books in the world to contain all that Jesus taught. His wisdom is overwhelming. But we get this little glimpse of it here in these documentaries, and it's pretty cool. And you just hope that these scientists, like, they're coming at it from an intellectual basis, and they're seeing, okay, there's an intelligent designer. You would hope that then they're coming to faith in the designer, that then leads them to seek out the designer. Some famous scientists said the more you study science, the closer you get to God. Like, the further into science you go, you can't help but see him. He's everywhere. And Romans 1 talks about that. That's why man is without excuse. But anyways, I hope you're enjoying this. I like looking into this stuff. It's enjoyable for me. So we'll pick up on this same DVD here next time, and we'll be able to finish it up next time. So then after that, we'll start the Icons of Evolution one. But as always, I appreciate you guys watching. I love you, and we'll talk to you next time.